CNN has learned new details of the FBI investigation into potential links between individuals associated with the Trump campaign and the Russian government. CNN's Pamela Brown and Evan Perez join us now. They broke the story along with our justice reporter, Shimon Prokupez. Pam, first, what are you learning?
Well, Anderson, the FBI has information that indicates associates of President Donald Trump communicated with suspected Russian operatives to possibly coordinate the release of information damaging to Hillary Clinton's campaign, U.S. officials told us. FBI Director James Comey made his bombshell announcement, as you'll recall, Monday before Congress that the FBI is investigating the Trump campaign's ties to Russia. So the FBI is now reviewing this information, which includes human intelligence, travel, business, and phone records, as well as accounts of in-person meetings, according to the officials we've spoken with. And the information is raising the suspicions of FBI counterintelligence investigators that the coordination may have taken place, though officials we've spoken with cautioned that this information was not conclusive and that this investigation is ongoing. The FBI would not comment, nor would the White House, though Trump officials have denied there is any evidence of collusion, Anderson.
So, Evan, this gives more insight into what Director Comey knew when he spoke on Monday.
Well, that's right, Anderson. If you recall, in addition to Comey saying that the investigation includes looking at connections of Trump associates, he also explained what it means that the investigation is actually being done. Take a listen.
Don't you need some action or some information besides just attending a meeting, having been paid to attend a conference, that a picture was taken, or that you traveled to a country before you're open to investigation for counterintelligence by the FBI?
The standard is, I think there's a couple different at play: a credible allegation of wrongdoing or a reasonable basis to believe that an American may be acting as an agent of a foreign power.
One law enforcement official said that the information in hand suggests, quote, people connected to the campaign were in contact, and it appeared that they were giving the thumbs up to release information when it was ready. But other U.S. officials who we spoke to said it's premature to draw that inference from the information that they've gathered so far, since at this point it's largely circumstantial. The FBI cannot yet prove that collusion actually took place, but the information suggesting collusion is now a large part of the focus of this investigation, according to the officials we've talked to.
And Pamela, what sort of coordination is under investigation?
So we're told mostly the FBI is focused on the stolen and published emails by WikiLeaks, including the DNC and Clinton's campaign's John Podesta. Now, U.S. officials said the information being investigated was not drawn from the leaked dossier of unverified information compiled by that former British intelligence official, compiled for Trump's political opponents, though the dossier also suggested coordination between Trump campaign associates and Russian operatives, Anderson.
So, Evan, do we know who's being investigated?
Well, the sources we talked to would not say who was connected, these people who are connected to Trump that are being investigated here, but we do know that the FBI was already investigating 4 former Trump campaign associates: Michael Flynn, Paul Manafort, Roger Stone, and Carter Page, for contacts with Russians known to U.S. intelligence. Now, all 4 of those people have denied improper contacts. And Anderson, one of the interesting things is that we have some obstacles now in the way of the FBI investigation. The FBI is facing the fact that, trying to find this conclusive evidence. They're facing the fact that communication between Trump's associates and these Russians has ceased in recent months, given all the public focus on these Russia ties in the Trump campaign. And then some of these Russian officials have also changed their methods of communications, making monitoring that much more difficult, according to the officials that we talked to.
All right, Evan, Pam, thanks very much. I want to bring in our panel, political analyst Maggie Haberman and Carl Bernstein. She's a New York Times White House correspondent. He's a legendary Watergate journalist and author. Also, CNN counterterrorism analyst Phil Mudd, formerly a senior official of the FBI and CIA, and CNN political director David Chalian. So, Maggie, you just heard that reporting. It would certainly seem to underscore why the FBI is investigating coordination between the Trump campaigns and Russians known to U.S. intelligence.
Yeah, it continues to suggest, I think 2 things are happening. I think that information suggests that there is a basis for what the FBI is doing, why they are trying to get to what was at the heart of these contacts. We still don't know what they were. It also, the second piece of it is that as you have sort of a chess game going on where you have Nunes from the House committee, the Republican chairman, tell reporters today that actually there is some intelligence that suggests that Trump campaign aides may have been intercepted in ways that Trump had suggested, as if this was ordered by President Obama, which he had contended. we now get more information about the Russia aspect of it. I think that the Russia question remains unsolved. It is still not clear, I think, what exactly we're looking at, the scope of this. We know the figures who were involved and that they are looking at communications and travel, it sounds like, in meetings, which we basically knew. But this is becoming a low-grade fever that shows no sign of breaking for this administration. And that's very challenging as you go on, either in a campaign or in an administration where you are trying to do something legislative and you have this going on. This White House has a habit of creating all kinds of self-inflicted wounds. Without this is deeply troubling for them.
Yeah, David, whether it's a low-grade fever, as Maggie describes, or kind of the drip, drip, drip of information coming out, how significant is this information we're learning tonight? Again, there's been plenty of smoke before, still no fire.
Right. We all know, as the FBI director said on Monday, this investigation is about looking into possible coordination. That's the ball game here at the end of the day. Whether or not there's there, Anderson, means whether or not there's provable coordination between the Trump campaign and Russian associates to help him win and defeat Hillary Clinton. So this reporting is a step in that direction. So it's certainly not good for the Trump administration. But, both President Trump and Sean Spicer, as recently as Monday again, have been asked this question directly about whether or not they were aware, if President Trump was aware of any of his associates during the campaign talking to Russian officials. He's on record saying, no, not at all. He's on record saying Paul Manafort's denied it. And then he just went on to say, the president did say, Russia's a ruse. So
you know what, actually, David, let me play that Sean Spicer saying that just for our viewers.
Does the president, now that we know that there is an ongoing investigation by the FBI, does the president stand by his comments that he's not aware of any contacts that his campaign associates had with Russia during the election?
Yes.
Okay, and then the second one is, has anyone from the White House...
Well, can I just amend the first?
Sure.
Obviously, just to be clear, I know that I'm trying to think through this for a second because obviously General Flynn,
Right.
But again,
during the campaign.
Right,
Before the election.
and I'm not aware of any at this time, but even General Flynn was a volunteer of the campaign. And then obviously there's been this discussion of Paul Manafort, who played a very limited role for a very limited amount of time. But beyond, hey, Jonathan, hold on. Can you stop interrupting other people's questions? Okay, Jonathan, somebody's asking a question. It's not your press briefing. Julie's asking a question. Please calm down. Julie.
Are you saying then that the president is aware of contacts that Manafort...
No, nothing that hasn't been previously discussed. I just don't want to make it look like we're not aware of the stuff that's been.
I mean, David, it is telling that they are distancing themselves from the former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, saying, he had a very limited role for a very limited amount of time. I mean, he was everywhere.
There's no doubt about that. They're trying to erase a 5-month period of the campaign where he was actually, for a big chunk of that time, running the show, Anderson. But what you heard there from Sean said, nothing that hasn't already been discussed. Well, here we are, new reporting tonight, hasn't been discussed before, and it's about alleging potential coordination here. And so this is going to continue to ask the question, as Maggie was saying, it just, in terms of the low-grade fever, you're going to continue to have the question asked to the White House. So what exactly did the president know? When did he know it, or his closest aides?
Phil, you worked in both FBI and CIA. If you were part of the FBI investigation, this was the information you were seeing, what would your next move be?
First of all, we got to slow down here. The FBI director has announced the investigation. I would be telling the counterintelligence guys, take your time. When this one goes public, regardless of whether the FBI decides to bring charges or not, this is going to be picked over even more than the Clinton email investigation. So if you're in a leadership position, the first thing you got to do is cross every T. This is not about whether we have suspicions of contacts. This is about whether you can prove that in a court of law. The second thing we haven't talked about, Anderson, and let me be clear on this, this is not simply about whether there was contact or collusion between Trump officials and the Russians. If you're inside the Bureau, this is about whether someone lied to a federal officer during the investigation. That is, there were contacts, whether they are illegal or not, and they told the federal investigator something else. Inside the Bureau, that'll tick people off, and furthermore, that is a federal violation.
Right. You can't lie to the FBI as a crime.
You can't do it. So you would be looking both at the facts of the case, and they're still murky, and what people have said along the way and whether their stories are changing.
Carl, I mean, for you, what new questions does tonight's reporting raise? And certainly nothing, I guess, that'll be answered in an open hearing.
Well, I've been saying for a while that there's a cover-up going on here, and the cover-up is among those who worked in the Trump campaign and associates of Trump. And it's now becoming much more clear what it is that they have been concealing, which are these contacts, and which revolve around leaked emails from Podesta's account. So the questions that I would want to know is actually of the White House. Why cannot the President of the United States and Sean Spicer and others, instead of pushing back against these investigations, say, we want to get to the bottom of this. We want to open up everything. I, the President of the United States, want to call these people in and ask them what happened. What is this all about? What we're seeing is pushback, smoke screens, an attempt to keep away from what really happened here by the President of the United States, by Sean Spicer, and that raises a whole set of additional questions.
Maggie, I mean, it's not just, the smoke screens, it's also diversions, shiny objects, allegations against other people, allegations against the Clinton campaign having contacts with Russia. It's going to be interesting to see how President Trump or Sean Spicer respond to this latest reporting, if in fact they do. I mean, they pointed out before that former DNI Clapper said he didn't see any conclusive intelligence that there was coordination. Clapper himself has since clarified he was referring to before January 20th, and obviously investigation is still ongoing.
I think it was about a week and a half ago that Sean Spicer said, we'll have nothing further to say on this topic. He wasn't talking about Russia, but he was talking about the president's allegation of surveillance against him, either as a candidate or during the transition. These two things have been tethered together, and Spicer has continued to comment on it in basically every briefing, including today, where he read a litany of allegations and related facts about the Clintons. The election is over, and so at a certain point, I think it is going to be really hard for the White House to keep trying to pivot to either a vanquished candidate or the media is out to get us. At a certain point, they are either going to have to say, to Carl's point, I think it's a really important one, the president has not expressed much concern or worry that a foreign entity may have did meddle, according to the intelligence community, in the election that he won. He sees it as delegitimizing, and therefore he never addresses it that way. But there is a broader problem here, and the White House has both been undisciplined about this and has had contradictory messages.
It's also interesting, Maggie, because the president, Sean Spicer, have talked about the importance of investigating leaks. So
right.
If they certainly have not shown the same enthusiasm for trying to get to the bottom. I think Sean Spicer, generally his comments have been along the lines of, well, if they want to do that, go ahead.
Right. The leaks are very, very frustrating and consuming to the West Wing. They are personally grating and troubling to the president. I've heard from several people. My colleague Glenn Thrush has heard the same thing. And they are finding a way to deal with it. Some of this is the newness of this president in a government and a leaky bureaucracy that he cannot control. He's used to having full control as a businessman and as a candidate. And some of this is just that the information is not a great fact set for them, and they have not figured out how to deal with it.
You were saying
Anderson,
newness, not a pun on Devin Nunes, I assume. But yes, sorry, Carl.
That the heroes, and I don't want to draw the Watergate analogy substantively here, but the heroes of Watergate were really Republicans. They were Republicans in the House and the Senate who wanted this investigated to the bottom. What did the president know and when did he know it? As was stated by the Republican Senator Howard Baker from Tennessee. That's what we're not seeing here. We're not seeing it from the Republicans on the Hill either, who are consumed by supposedly looking for leaks. Many of the same Republicans decrying the leaks are those who have leaked classified information themselves on numerous occasions, which I'm sure Maggie, others on our panel tonight can attest to. I certainly can. Look at the Benghazi inquiry of and what was leaked there. So these smoke screens, instead of us hearing that we want to get to the bottom of this from Republicans, not just the White House, is becoming very conspicuous.